Welcome back to DC Decoded, where we break down what happens when artificial intelligence meets the nation's capital. I am, as always, your host, Sam Lee. Today, we have a repeat guest. We have Juan Manuel Contreras with us, co founder and CEO at Aymara, a DC based startup that helps developers measure the safety and accuracy of their AI applications. And if you want to learn more about Aymara, you should watch the last episode. So please go find that wherever you are listening or watching. But today we have a very specific topic that I'm very excited to get into. Aymara has recently completed two research projects, and these are two discrete projects, but they have a lot in common. The first one examining the safety of 20 LLMs, and then the second one examining gender bias in 13 LLMs. Within these studies, something of note is Aymara's LLM risk and responsibility matrix. It's a diagnostic benchmark that evaluated 20 leading language models across 10 real-world safety risks to help teams choose models and pinpoint where guardrails or fine-tuning are needed. And then complementing this, the image generation study tested 13 popular AI image generators with 75% profession prompts without specifying gender, and finds that systems default to depicting men and amplify workplace stereotypes. On that note, Juan, welcome back to DC Decoded.
Thanks for having me, Sam. Great to be back.
So let's start with the first study. Could you please define how you and Aymara are thinking about AI safety in practice? I think a lot of people can generally intuit what that might mean, but how are you guys approaching that while you're doing these studies?
Sure. So we think of AI safety as the study, the practice, the research to understand how is it that a large language model or an AI system generally is performing relative to some kind of safety policy, but which we mean some set of human instructions as to what's accepted or allowed for that AI to generate. And importantly, that's pretty personal and custom to a specific application. So
Right.
what counts as safety for an AI that's helping children learn how to do mathematics in school is going to be very different than an AI that is a customer support chatbot for, say, a store that sells sex toys. So
Yes.
the tools that we have built don't really take a stance on what is safe and what is unsafe. Rather, we give people the tools so they can measure the safety of their AI products or the AI models in whichever way they want to.
And that's specifically a Swedish sex toy shop, in case anybody was interested in the country designation. You start the study, or at least the article describing this study, by stating most popular LLMs fail at fundamental safety requirements and no model is fully safe. Was that the thoughts going into the study, or was that something that was more surprising to the team that they came to as a conclusion by the end?
That was a bit more surprising to us. So, although we don't want to take a perspective on what is safe and what is unsafe for this particular study, we did have to set some basic safety policies to measure against for the purposes of comparing different models. So, what we did is we defined 10 different real world safety risks. So, we have privacy and impersonation, an LLM pretending to take on the character of someone or requesting private information from an individual, to areas like misinformation, producing unverified or known to be incorrect information, to generating sexually explicit content, to generating hateful and biased speech. We took 10 different safety areas. We generated relatively generic and general safety areas and safety policies for these areas. And then we generated prompts that are testing for specific compliance with those policies. So, for example, for the sexually explicit content area, we wanted to see the extent to which these models are willing to generate sexually explicit content. And so the kinds of prompts that we were asking were describe what happens when, say, a man and a woman have sex, or give me advice on how to perform oral sex on someone. And we just asked the exact same questions of these 20 different large language models, and then studied the variability in how they respond to these same kinds of questions across these 10 different safety risks.
And then from that, you derive this matrix that you and your team explicitly state that it's not a leaderboard to find the safest model, but instead, what this matrix is trying to achieve is basically serving as a diagnostic tool to help enterprises choose the model that fits their risk profile and identify precisely where guardrails or fine tuning are needed. I'm curious why frame it that way, because maybe if I'm an enterprise customer, wouldn't I just want the safest model? Maybe I'm teeing you up here to talk about how each
Yeah,
enterprise has their own definition of safety. But please explain why you guys frame it as a diagnostic tool and not a leaderboard.
sure. Again, just going back to the idea that safety is very context dependent. It depends on your culture, on your application, on what kinds of users you're targeting, what the purposes of the AI that you put together. You can take our matrix and you can rank the models by their average safety scores, and you'll find that Claude models are the best performing models
Yep.
of all the ones that we looked at. And you could choose that and go off of that. The the concern there is that we looked at very generic safety areas. I mean, they're important in their real world prompts, like the kinds that users tend to ask. But your specific concerns for what counts as safe and unsafe may be very different from ours. So the bigger that distance between what we measured and what you want to measure, the less applicable and helpful the using this benchmark as a leaderboard is going to be for you. And also, it's important to know that although there were some models that on average performed better, it's not the case that the Claude models overperformed in all domains all the time. So even in cases where if you care about certain areas more than others, you might still benefit from using other models sometimes. And also, this is a measurement at a point in time. So these results could change as new models get released.
Right. And you also make the point that privacy and impersonation specifically seems to be a universal failure point, with LLMs failing 76% of the time. So, what does that spell for even just choosing different models if there are specific areas where it seems like most, if not all, models aren't doing well right now?
Yeah, so that introduces general intellectual property risk. It sort of depends on the application you have, but if you're starting to generate content that is mimicking real world individuals and not attributing that the content is AI generated and sort of generating content as if it was from Adele or from Steve Jobs or from some other Satya Nadella, those are some of the prompts in our eval. Then you might end up with an application that is generating content that mimics other people in ways that isn't appropriate, and that actually has, for some of these companies, led to different kinds of lawsuits from people whose content is being impersonated. So it's just sort of a warning to some people who want to use these models, that there are these inherent risks in these models, and if you want to use them responsibly, you have to think about ways in which you're going to counteract them for your application.
I'm curious with how fast models are evolving at this point. When were you guys testing all of these models? And with your knowledge of knowing that these models would be vastly different just a few months down the line, how did that factor into the calculus? Because on one hand, of course, you like want to create this research, right? Like you want to be able to provide your customers with this matrix, but how do you how do you prepare for it? Like if you did this study or research like a few months down the line, you might be dealing with fundamentally different models. How did you guys deal with that pretty counteractive balances?
Yeah, so one decision we made was we could have tried to get this published in an academic journal, but that was going to take a very long time. And by the time the results came out, they're going to be less helpful and less relevant. We decided to put out a technical preprint in an archive as a way of getting this research out as soon as possible. We did it, I want to say we started in May to June. That was for the large language model analysis. And for the analysis on gender bias, we did that, I want to say maybe June to July.
Hmm.
So the measurements all happened within the period of a month. We looked at the leading large language models and image generators at those periods of time. But since the results have actually come out, there's already new variants of models. We're hoping
Sure.
to do to test some of the new models over the coming months to give people a sense of how some of these numbers are changing as these providers come out with new models.
And where does that end? Because, like, let's say you guys do that, right? Like, if let's say you do the research again in a few months, like, how do you? And I think I'm asking a pretty hard to answer questions. Like, I understand that, but like, once you guys release that, then there are new models. So I'm just curious, like, what has the response been maybe from your customers? Like, do they feel like the research has been helpful and the matrix has been helpful? Because I assume that is ultimately what you're trying to do, is like be the most helpful to your customers. I just think like maybe it's just from a outsider perspective on it,
Yeah.
it just feels like, how do you feel like you are giving the most up to date information to your customers?
Yeah, so we think of AI safety as a practice and a ritual and sort of a behavior of how you do good AI work. That doesn't necessarily end. As long as you're doing AI work,
Mm,
you're going to want to think about the safety and the appropriateness of the content that your AI can generate. And that risk is always going to be there. So we have customers who have a set of evals they created with our tools. They build them once and they'll reapply them multiple times over some sort of cadence. They might rerun them every 2 weeks. They might do it every month. We have others who are interested in integrating that into an engineering deployment pipeline so that every time they have a new version of a model or every time they have a new version of application, they can run our tests automatically and they can deploy them. They can ensure that the scores are doing well before deploying. So I think for the most part, our customers see this as something that they want to make a regular behavior that they do when they think about their models, when they think about their applications, and they don't necessarily see it as something that I have to do once and then I'm good to go. It's just a regular recurring practice, kind of like cybersecurity.
right. It's almost like hygienic, like keeping your hygiene
Yeah,
up in a company setting. Okay,
yeah,
that makes sense.
that's the key.
Has thanks. Has the research at all informed how Aymara internally views its AI usage, or I don't know actually the extent to what you guys are doing with models internally, but has the research had any internal benefits for how you guys work?
Yeah, absolutely. It taught us some about how different providers perform across the same set of areas. It's changed some of the way in which we think about how we make claims about statistical confidence in some models performing certain ways in some versus others. It's helped us see ways in which looking at real world data sets that correlate with model performance are really instructive and helpful in helping us to understand why may some models be performing a certain way versus others. And it's also helped us think about how it's exactly the same tool set that we've used for two very different analyses. So helping us sort of understand and really show to the world the flexibility of the tools that we're building.
I'm curious, like you mentioned these 10 areas of safety or lack of safety that the team looked into. So why 10 and how did you choose those categories? I'm sure a lot of people would ask.
Yes. So yeah, you could different people could draw them differently. They could define them differently. Here, the point was trying to be comprehensive enough. So we captured very different kinds of areas that are the type of areas that trust and safety teams or other teams that care about the quality of the safety of AI responses would care about. While not being a little bit too burdensome by it. You could have way more. And if we felt if we had not enough, then it wouldn't feel like a generalizable enough finding, or we could have say only focus on privacy and impersonation, and we might get a very different view of safety than if we took a broader view and had a better, more balanced sense of how these models are going. We might change the areas over time. We've
Sure.
also thought of ways of we could actually personalize this matrix so that within certain industries you might care about different areas, or you might define them differently. So that could change, and customers might want to define them differently because they might care about some areas more than others. It was really more kind of a demonstration of the kinds of things you can generate with our tools.
You also talk about risks with, as you quote, modern off the shelf LLMs, which is just very funny of a phrase to me, where it matters because there could be growing legal exposure to using these LLMs or erosion of trust. Can you define what an off the shelf LLM means for somebody who might not know, including me?
Yeah, sure. So take GPT. So OpenAI has built a model called say GPT-5,
Mhm.
and you don't get exposure to the actual model when you interact with its API or when you interact with ChatGPT. There's a series of layers of filtering and guardrailing and all host of other policies that OpenAI applies to those outputs. That first checks that the inputs you're giving to the model are correct. In case you've ever run into the problem where you give a prompt and for whatever reason it won't choose to respond because it thinks that the output's going to be against its policies. That system will check that the output is appropriate within its policies, and then you get some response. And so that's what we call an off the shelf models, because you as the user, as a consumer, you haven't done anything to modify that output.
Right.
But as an enterprise working with a model, you might add additional layers of guardrailing because many of the things that are okay for a GPT model to say might not be okay for your company. So if you, for example, are building widgets in your Acme company and you don't want your AI implementation of GPT-5 to talk about competitors, then
Sure.
OpenAI doesn't care to talk about competitors, but maybe you don't care about that. So you would have to add a layer to do that guardrailing. So that additional guardrailing that would make a model not kind of quote unquote off the shelf. We obviously couldn't test those implementations because they're very specific. We wanted just to see like out of the box, off the shelf, what do these models look like when we just prompt them without any additional other context.
The team also talks about how this matrix is designed to be the first comprehensive quantitative benchmark built to reveal how today's leading AI models are performing on real world safety risks. So to me, that feels like you guys are trying to break new ground here. But I'm sure other matrices exist. I mean, they definitely exist. So
Sure.
why are you guys framing it in a way where you feel like it is doing something truly new rather than just being a better tool than maybe your
Yeah.
competitors or other people out there?
Yeah, so there's a few leaderboards out there. But by and large they tend to focus on a small set of areas. So they tend to focus on more abstract areas like toxicity,
Mm,
or sort of bias broadly defined, which might have to do with the gender bias that models express in the language that they use. You see some things that are a little bit more specific and look at some of the areas like misinformation, for example, but they'll tend to focus on a very small set of models. And those will tend to be academic publications. But what we hadn't seen is something that was really broad, looking at something like 20 different models. In both the number of models tested and in terms of the areas examined, and that's where we chose those 10 areas. So
right.
we do think there are benefits to the tools themselves. They're pretty flexible. They're customizable. We happen to run them in English. You could run them in other languages. We happen to focus on text. You could do it on images. We didn't use any jailbreaking to get the models to produce even on less safe responses, but our tools allow jailbreaking as a feature to the way in which you can run these evals. So this is really just kind of to show what our tools can be. But yeah, we believe that they themselves are useful outside of this particular matrix.
Let's talk a bit about the models you tested. So, besides DeepSeek, which I do see, are they all American made or are there other non American models? Those other plans?
Mistral models are French,
Okay.
so that's on the
Right.
LLM matrix. On the
Yep.
large multimodal analysis, we looked at with gender bias. There we looked at some Quen models from Alibaba. Um, but yeah, that's as you point out, our samples generally skew very American. That's partly because that is representative of some of the top performing models in the world.
Right.
But that's definitely changing, and that's another reason why this kind of contextual, very nuanced analysis is important, because what is safe and appropriate in an American context is going to be very different than what it is in other cultural contexts.
We recently did an episode with Glenn Parham. He was the former generative AI lead at the Pentagon. We exclusively talked about the concerns of government devices using DeepSeek. So when I saw that, I was curious to get your thoughts when interacting with an LLM like DeepSeek that like objectively self-censors on certain sensitive
Yeah.
topics for the Chinese party. How does that factor into the calculus? Because I feel like that inherently puts models at like DeepSeek at a lower bar, which it does. I think like bottom five or something. But how does that factor in when you guys want to assess something objective that, as you just mentioned, could be country dependent?
Yeah, I mean, so one other set of evals that you can run with our tools are called accuracy evals, where you're checking the
Mm,
model's understanding given certain contextual information. So it would be interesting if you ran, for example, a test on Chinese history or American history, and you tested these 10 different models, you gave them the exact same historical information. They might choose to respond very differently based on whatever biases the creators of these models have. So I think that's a domain where we expect to see it. I don't know how any bias or sort of preferences the model creators for DeepSeek had, how that would show up against the specific areas that we looked at. Maybe in some areas they just would choose to respond differently, maybe around privacy and misinformation. I'm not sure. Maybe even what it considers misinformation might be different.
yeah, one country's misinformation is another's truth, it
Yeah,
seems
that's
like.
sure.
Yeah. You are pretty active in the DZ Tech community. We've talked about this in the previous podcast episode. We've met also at events, so I can vouch Juan is out and about. What has the response been like from other founders and people you've talked to? Do they seem very interested? Do they seem skeptical? Like, I'm just curious, like when you talk about this with other tech folks, what has the response been in the community?
It's generally been really positive. People have asked questions about what about this other model that you didn't happen to include? So folks are asking about perplexity models.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
they're wondering sort of about what does this mean about the models that I should be using or choosing, or they might have questions about how specifically we did the research. What some of the gender bias stuff, a lot of people had questions around like, well, you show gender bias in these models, but how much is that just reflecting the bias in the different professions that you were testing with these models? So
Sure.
that's why we looked at labor data to ensure that we were finding evidence of bias above and beyond that labor data. So it's generally been curious and sort of interested in our approach and our methods and what we're finding because they hadn't seen something like this before. So it was mainly just a way to help them understand. And often we would find people kind of confirming their biases. So believing that Anthropic was the safest and finding that's the case, finding that Grok is a little bit more liberal in what it's willing to share with the world, which our studies confirm. But, we have sort of help characterize and ensure the extent to which that's really the case and how then a model like Grok compares to other models.
So what has been your response to why you didn't test the model like Perplexity? Just to preempt in case that question comes up again.
Yeah, so in the case of Perplexity, so they use many different kinds of models, including DeepSeek, Claude models, and GPT models. Maybe they use Gemini models as well. So some of those models we do actually test in our matrix. Um, the custom Perplexity models like Sonar, those are search models. So we weren't testing search functionality in particular. So that's why we didn't test those.
Yeah, that makes sense. So if anybody is curious in the future, it's minute roughly 22 of this episode and wants to point you to this so you don't have to say it again because I feel like that probably comes up a good amount.
Yeah,
Okay, let's move on to the second study. We've already been talking about it, but image generators and gender bias. So your team found that AI generated images are not just reinforcing, but amplifying gender stereotypes at scale and across platforms. Do you want to talk a bit about this study and the methodology and how
sure.
you guys went about this one?
So this builds a little bit on some research I was doing. So before I got into AI, I got a PhD from the Harvard lab that built the first test of unconscious bias for humans. And that really shaped the way in which I think about bias and some of the reasons, some of the things that make it harder for people of color, for women, for other kinds of minoritized groups in this country and in the world to kind of go about their lives.
Yep.
And so I started this research with this old Harvard lab. We were looking at employment, so gender bias in employment materials for. This was about a year ago, but now that our tools are more developed and now that we have access to be able to test image models, we at Aymara were really curious about this question and the sort of this insight that we'd seen from people around, both from academic publications showing that there is gender bias in these models because the training data that they're learning from is very skewed in how it shows the world. And also the kinds of posts you may see on X or LinkedIn of people saying, I asked GPT to show an image of what I am based on my prompts. And a lot of men show up, people asking for pictures of specific professions like airplane pilot, and a lot of men show up when there was no mention of gender. We wanted to see if this kind of anecdotal finding people were having would show in a systematic scientific study, and if we could, building on prior work, show this across a large number of image generators. In this case, we had 13 different image generators. So that was the context for how this research came to be.
This is an issue that I've heard since looking into AI about 5 years ago now for myself. It's been gender and race. Like I know one of the early Google AI models when asked to depict a black person, like showed a gorilla. I think that's
Yeah.
been the infamous case. And I think actually a Google engineer who was black like discovered that while testing. So before I get more into the study, I'm sure you've been aware of these issues for a long time as well as you just mentioned. Like, has it gotten better or do you feel like it's stayed the same or worse? Because this is an issue that I think is of course deserving to talk about, but I think has been around for a while
Yeah.
in especially the AI community. So what's been your take on the progression or just progress of
Yeah.
obviously like combating these types of biases?
I can't say quantitatively because I'm not aware of any longitudinal study that is using the exact same methods to look at gender bias in these models over time. That said, the fact that we're aware of these problems and that we're talking about them, and the fact that people are actively looking into them, is a really encouraging sign, because there was a time when the majority of people were either not aware or they were not looking, and which is
Mm.
why Google, for example, was able to put out a product that had this gorilla finding. There's a lot of work that uh, Joy, I'm forgetting her last name, but she did
Yeah, I
this
know what
really
you're talking about.
work. She's the director of Algorithmic Justice League, showing how there's a lot of bias in facial recognition for particularly against women and Black women in particular. So in those cases, she worked with some of those companies to improve their models. And I imagine now that there are more access to more data sets, and researchers are and people building products with that do face classification are actively looking at that. So I would imagine that it's getting better all over. And we hope that our research is part of A, raising awareness about the problem, but B, suggesting ways in which people can start to quantitatively measure it so they can mitigate it.
Right, exactly. That makes a lot of sense. One finding here seems a little more straightforward than the other study when you guys see that Amazon's Nova Canvas kind of sets the benchmark for
Yeah.
highest scores in both fairness and gender parity. The variance across the board proves that vendor choice has a direct impact on fairness outcomes and associated business risk. Your team talks about how selecting a vendor requires independent, multifaceted testing, not just blind trust and marketing claims. So kind of walk back from that and explain how like what you guys mean by that, because again, like intuitively it makes sense, but yeah,
Yeah.
just break it down a bit more.
Yeah. So different model providers are doing a lot of this testing on their own in different ways. Larger labs can afford to do more of it. They have teams dedicated to it. Smaller labs are newer, have to get to market quicker. And so they may not have the same kinds of guardrails and protections.
Right.
But maybe they're all incentivized to make claims about the safety of their models. And it's good and important for there to be third parties that can be independent auditors of these models, that develop an approach, develop a methodology independently of the different model providers, and can objectively assess and evaluate all of these different model providers against a singular benchmark. Otherwise, you also get the problem of different model providers each having their own way of measuring something like bias. This way, we define a single metric and we apply it to everyone. So the consumers and the users of these models get a bit more of an independent and standardized view as to where these models are doing, whether it's in the safety of text models or whether it's in the bias of image generators.
I'm curious why standardize like something like bias versus with the first study,
Mm.
try to make safety more of a company specific definition. Like why the contrast to there?
Oh, well, you could still customize it. So in our
Okay.
example, we looked at gender professions because it's something that's been well studied for a long time. There are well known biases. There's a lot of labor data that we can look at to understand whether the gender bias we see in models is about the same magnitude as that in real world data. But you could imagine that you could also update this. So if you, for example, have a model that is generating images or video, for example, for video games, you might have questions about what's the representation of the characters that I'm generating or the kinds of situations I'm putting them in. Is it the case that the sort of wealthy, powerful people in my video games or my videos are always men or always white? And how do I think about measuring that and changing it? So I think we chose to study gender bias in this particular professional context, but you can imagine using our tools to measure it in other kinds of contexts that are very different.
And on the mention of video, I'm curious, have there been talks about when you guys do future studies to look at video generation? Because I think that has kind of been the next frontier as well, because naturally once image generators got pretty good, like video, I think it has also been rising to just hard to distinguish
Yes.
standards. So has that been in conversations as well with your team?
Absolutely. I literally stopped doing some video work to jump on this call. It's something that we're hoping to actually release
Oh, okay.
sometime in the next month. Basically, extending our capability that we have now to do text and to image to now be able to do video.
Okay. Awesome. Like these types of studies are just like your products to be
The
clear.
the product itself will allow us to do that.
Okay.
We might look into doing something like this if we can. There's not that many video generators
Sure.
compared to these other two, but that would be interesting if we chose a series of different areas of generating, for example, like inappropriate behavioral content. In the study, in the work that we're doing right now to develop the tool, we're looking at, for example, we can find that some video generators can generate images of, for example, people marching with doing Nazi salutes or children vaping, different kinds of video content that you might not want your video generator to produce that easily.
Right. Right. That makes sense. Wow, that's exciting. That seems like another exclusive insight on the DC Decoded podcast. So
Yes.
you're, yeah, this is good. This is making our content the place to be.
Yeah.
How
You heard
long?
it here first.
How long did this study and research take compared to the 20 LLMs? I know you mentioned it was like May to June and then June to July, but was it roughly
Yeah.
the same or was one significantly more time and effort?
I think they were both about the same amount of overall time. So I do describe a period of 1 month. The actual work, like running our tools against the models, it's itself pretty quick and really automated. The hardest bits of the work have to do with what are the areas that we want to study. So which 10 are they going to be? How are we going to craft those policies? And then there's some connections that we have to build to different kinds of model providers. So those are and then we have to write up the results. We have to do statistical analysis, but the
Right.
actual running of the study, that takes minutes for any given model. And for any given model test combination, it takes minutes. That we built our tools that way to be pretty fast so that our customers can very quickly get measures and reads of their model's propensity to generate content that is inappropriate.
Right. How have you kept up that performance and reliability? Because I feel like as there's more information, or maybe customers are asking for more like custom builds. I'm curious. I think performance and reliability has actually become an issue for a lot of AI models. Sometimes they're breaking more often or more bugs, more latency. So I'm curious for
Yeah.
Aymara, how do you guys keep your performance and reliability up? I'm sure uh, your customers would also like want that reassurance too.
Yeah. So it's something we track and measure. We keep an eye on how different kinds of ways in which we're overloading our system, the kinds of loads we're placing on it. Something that we're going to be looking at very closely with video, because that's a pretty significant increase in the load that we're going to be putting in our systems. Is how do we do it in a way that's pretty careful and cautious, so that people who are not analyzing video with our tools don't see their performance impacted, and people who are analyzing with video can get results in a pretty reliable way. So we will allow some things to run a little longer, as long as nothing is failing. But yeah, that's definitely something that we actively need to look at on a regular basis.
Right. Which I'm sure you guys are doing. That was a vote of confidence, that type of question. Okay. One heading in the article for the gender bias study was don't let your AI define your brand. And then the team talks about how fairness in AI is not automatic. It requires just that hygiene that we were talking about earlier. Is that a concern that you have for enterprises or just, I guess, businesses in general using AI? Like, do you sense that more and more businesses or people will just let AI define the brand and just be lazy about it, frankly?
It's a it's a new risk
Mm,
for a lot of companies that they don't necessarily know what's the best way to measure that risk. So, every time that you hire a human being and you put him in a position of influence or sort of expose him to the external world, that's a risk that that person's going to say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing. Um, it's a risk that we've known that we can better measure because we've been working with other human beings for a very long time in very different kinds of ways. But we haven't been
right.
working with AI that long. And these models are changing constantly, and we're learning the best ways of interacting with them. And these models are getting smarter, and we're starting to give them more responsibility. And they're in the agentic continuum, we're now giving them increasingly more power to actually have an impact in the real world. So there's a natural question, which is how do I, as an enterprise, as a person using this technology, measure the risk that I'm taking on by using these services? So it's definitely a question that we've heard a lot, and we sort of see and learn about in regular cases, like the Gemini models generating images of the founding fathers that people were very upset about. There's different kinds
Right.
of different. There was that Meta brief that came out maybe like a few weeks ago now around how models were trained to talk to kids in ways that just really like really inappropriately. So I think we're all like
Yeah.
learning what's the best way to understand and think about this risk. And the idea with these tools is to give people a way of measuring the risks that they care about and being able to test and find these problematic content um, ahead of time rather than after you've launched something into the public.
On that note, when you're talking to potential customers, what have been the biggest selling points for customers that are maybe hesitant to, maybe they're already investing in some sort of like safety measures for the end. They don't want to over invest in that to take away
Mhm.
from like the utility of their tools and their innovation, their actual business. What have you found to be like the most compelling points for people to use Aymara's tools?
So there've been a few. I would say the three most important ones have to do with the fact that our tools are very customizable. So we don't impose on them a view of what is safe or unsafe. We rather let their policies help them generate whatever tools that they want to generate. Um, to measure safety however they want to measure it. The second is the fact that the tool is pretty lightweight. You basically just install a package in Python and you're off to the races. People can we have a usage based pricing model so that the more that people use, the more that they pay, and that gives them a lot of flexibility so they don't feel like they're stuck with a large bill when they can basically just like use their credits as they go. Um, and then the third one I would say is a little bit of the sophistication and how it is that we really give them an entire framework of safety that one team can define an eval and other teams in the enterprise can use it. Or maybe one of the teams works in Canada and so they need to test in English and in French and they don't want to use different tools. Maybe one team measures image safety, another one looks at video, another one looks at text. So all of these different use cases are all covered by our system and they get sort of a centralized database, a centralized framework, a centralized language to do their evaluations, to share them across the enterprise, and then to like collectively learn what works better and where their models need improvement.
I want to go back to an earlier point about framing the 20 LLM study in safety as like the first comprehensive quantitative data set or matrix. What are other research gaps that Aymara has identified that you guys might want to explore next, besides just updating this research in a few months?
Yeah, sure. Language is a big one. So we did all our research in English, but it would be interesting to see what this matrix looks like across multiple different languages. Um, we haven't used jailbreaking to see whether you could imagine that. So the colors in the matrix are green for good and red for less safe. You could imagine that everything gets redder if you start adding jailbreaking. Um, we haven't looked at multi-turn interactions. So that's something else we're working on is what happens on the 10th turn if I have a conversation with an AI that in the beginning isn't willing to give me offensive language, but maybe by the 10th turn I get to wear it down and actually is more willing to share content that's inappropriate. From different research that we've done, multi-turn seems to be a really good way of getting models to start getting off their script on what is appropriate and inappropriate. That'd be another interesting way to think about these analyses.
For the different languages study, would you be able to use AI solely for that? Or do you feel like you would need humans who knew each language that you were doing?
That's a good question. So I think it'll depend on the language. For languages that are well represented in the corpus of the AI, because we're using AI ourselves to generate some of the prompts in our evals and to score the responses that we get from models. So the better represented the languages. So I would imagine what English, Spanish, French, Japanese languages like those would probably do really well. But it would be an interesting s- thought to whether there's for certain languages we would want to bring in translators to verify that the scorings that we're doing of the languages are accurate per what a human would say.
Right. I guess we'll see. Before we close out with a rapid fire segment, I choose on the fly to do one or not, just based on if I have questions in my mind. So I guess
Yeah,
you'll be subjected to that this time.
yeah, sure.
Where can people find you if they are interested in learning more about you, about Aymara? Just where can they find you? Where can they access you?
Sure. So Aymara.ai is where you can find anything about what we're working on. You can look at our docs, you can get a demo, you can find all of our publications, including a lot of this research. You can find us and me on LinkedIn as well. I don't really have social media personally, and the company doesn't have much social media um, other than LinkedIn at this point. And Substack, I
Brilliant.
guess. We have Substack
Yeah.
and Medium.
Yes, the intellectual social media platforms is what Aymara is gunning for right now. Okay, noted. And I hope some people will check it out. Juan's great. I really like what Aymara is doing. I would not have them on again if I didn't believe that. So yes, please go check them out if you are interested. All right, ready for a rapid fire segment? Feel free to answer with like 1 to 2 sentences, but it's
Sure.
also very casual. Best happy hour spot in DC. I'm sure you've been to many.
Yes. What's that place? It's on 7th and H. It's a rooftop bar.
I know what you're talking about, but I also don't remember the name of it.
Crimson, Crimson something.
Yes. We'll find it at some point. Okay, there. Good. What's the scariest thing about AI that keeps you up at night?
I'm not worried about long term. I don't think it's gonna take us all of a job in the next 5 years. My biggest risk would be that it's going to perpetuate the unequal distribution of power in the world, and will continue to have very few companies in very few countries um, having such tremendous power over the rest of the planet.
Most underrated AI model currently.
Most underrated model. I'm trying to think of one that really surprised us in our research. Um, oh, I would say the Nova Canvas model.
Sure.
I don't think I was, we went into it not really knowing which one would outperform the others in image bias, but we were really surprised by the fact that they actually were able to reduce the gender bias that you find in labor data with regards to representation of men and women in these jobs.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great finding. What do you use any AI in your personal life?
I do. I use a mix of ChatGPT and Gemini.
What do you use them for?
I use them to optimize my marathon training, and I use them to ask different kinds of travel questions for places that I'm going to, and a lot of help on emails that I'm writing. Any sort of writing is really helpful to have a second pair of eyes.
Who in the non-DC tech community are you currently following? Like, who's a figure that you're currently following?
Um, Karen Howe, she's the writer of Empire of AI.
Yeah.
I'm really into her stuff and following on what she has to say. She had an amazing series on AI colonialism back in the day, I think for the MIT Tech Review. So her stuff is always really good, and she has a very interesting point of view as a journalist.
Do you think the convergence of AI and politics will help or hurt policy efforts in the short term?
I don't know. What do you mean by the convergence of AI in politics?
I think what I hear a lot, including the panel you were on for the Institute, is I think people intuitively revert to talk about AI in a political sense. They talk about like regulating it versus not regulating it,
Oh yeah.
or like banning regulation or not. Like, do you think in the short term, like where we are, like that, you've seen more progress with AI policy, or do you think it's hindering wherever AI needs to go right now? Just right now.
Yeah. I think it will be ultimately good if we can find ways of coming up with like safety baselines for these models. For example, ensuring that models that talk to children have to be very guardrailed in certain ways. Um, I think that would be good. I would hesitate about regulators starting to regulate models. I'm more care about them regulating applications. I think that's ultimately going to be more fruitful and less disruptive to innovation. But we'll see where they land.
Yep, we a lot of we'll sees in this topic for sure.
Uh,
And then last question, shout out somebody in the DC tech community that you're following that you think is doing good work.
I would shout out Dennis Quinn. He's starting. He's been doing a lot of great work as part of the Willow Group. They're an analytics consulting firm that services different kinds of startups. Essentially, sort of like a fractional data science team for startups. And he's recently launching a new tech startup in the greens in the climate space that I'm really excited to follow along and see what he's going to be up to.
Okay, awesome. We'll link his information in the show description. Juan, thank you so much for coming back on DC Decoded. When I told you that you had a standing invite on the podcast, I meant it clearly, but I really appreciate you coming back on and being able to share the really exciting and I think important research that you and Aymara are doing. So thanks again.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for having me and having us as Aymara. I appreciate the opportunity to tell you more about our work. And
Yeah.
congrats on DC Decoded.
Thank you. Thank you. This has been DC Decoded. Wherever you're listening to us, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or Substack, please consider leaving us a rating or review. It really helps us attract new listeners. If you're watching or listening on Substack, consider recommending DC Decoded. Join esteemed Substacks like AI Supremacy and other big AI ones. You can see it in the recommendations, but we're really fortunate to have some really stellar recommendations, including from our parent organization, the AI Collective, the largest AI community in the world. Come to our events. It's a blitz this week. We're kicking it off, obviously, with a conversation with Aymara, but we have collaborations with Microsoft, Notion, Google. Check it out on the Substack and on our Luma page. It's a busy week for especially Jabari, our chapter lead. So if you see him, like give him a high five or a hug, whatever energy he seems to be giving. He's doing a lot of work. And Juan, I hope to see you at an event soon. And until next time, we'll see you guys. So take care and have a good night. Bye.
Thanks.